There's an old story about a Texas oil man who retired, and he moved back home to Oklahoma, this small town in Oklahoma, and became a member of the little church that he had grown up in. Well, this little church was kind of run by the town banker, who was very prominent and very wealthy. And he sort of intimidated people. Every time there was a discussion about what to do or what decision to make or what program to launch, he would always stand up in the men's business meeting and said, "Well, brothers, I give a lot of money to this church, and I just think we oughta." And they would always do what he thought they oughta. Oh, the Texas oil man got a little annoyed with that. And so one time, and the next time he was there in the men's business meeting, and the banker stood up to start his speech. "Well, I've given a lot of money to this church." The oil man stood up and said, "Brother, how much money have you given to this church?" Well, the banker was a little bumfuzzled and said, what do you mean? What did you say? He said, I just want to know how much money that you've given to this church, because I'm getting ready to buy you out. Now, I don't know if that's a true story or not. Unfortunately, it is a true-to-life story. There are many churches that are run as if it were part of the kingdom of the world. There are many people that want to be prominent and want to have their way, and they'll use the ways of the world in order to have influence, in order to have power. In fact, that was something that caused some issues between Jesus and the apostles. There were several occasions when the apostles got into arguments over which of them was greatest in the kingdom. Jesus does this little demonstration with a child one time, because if you want to be great in the kingdom, you've got to be like this child. But they continued to argue about which one was the greatest. On one occasion in Mark 9, Jesus asked them, "What were y'all talking about as we were on the way?" And they wouldn't tell him because they were arguing about which one would be the greatest. The very next chapter, the apostles James and John come to Jesus and say, "When you come into your kingdom, let us sit on the left hand and the right hand." In other words, let us be the prime minister and his assistant. Let us have the positions of authority. And of course, Jesus rebukes them. But as soon as the apostles find out what they've asked, they again get into an argument over which one is the greatest. In fact, in Luke's telling of the story of the Last Supper, which we just went through as a commemoration of Jesus' death on the cross, that feast that, well, as he's preparing the apostles for that Last Supper, he tells them, "One of you is going to betray me." And they begin to discuss among themselves who that might be, which blossomed into a debate over which of them was greatest in the kingdom. At the Last Supper, they're arguing about which apostle was the greatest. Well, Jesus goes on to tell them in response to that. Jesus said to them, "The king of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call them benefactors. But I tell you not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you shall be like the youngest, and the one who rules is like the one who serves. But who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves." Jesus is in the same setting as he's just washed the apostles' feet. That's the story that John emphasizes in his telling of the upper room. He's just taken off a towel and gotten a basin of water and washed all of their feet. They sat there wondering which of the apostles would stoop. And he said, "Okay, who's the greatest? The one who serves or the one who sits at the table? But I, your master, am among you as one who serves." It's not the one who grabs the preeminence that is greatest in the kingdom, but the one who serves others. We continue, in fact, I've said this before, but it's this Sunday and then next Sunday will be the last in the series on the general epistles. We've been looking at instances in the writings of James and Peter and John, and next week Jude, where discussions are made of how our faith gets tested, either how we go through trials and tribulations that test our faith, or how we are put to the test whether or not we're going to live out our faith. Today we come to the book of 3 John. Now, if you look at 3 John, you will find that it is addressed, most of the general epistles are addressed generally to the church. This one is addressed to a man named Gaius. And we're going to meet 2 different people that give us examples of 2 different tests of our faith. Gaius' faith was tested by his willingness to practice hospitality and to serve other people, even though he might not even have known them, but to step into the service of God by serving God's people. There was another named Diotrephes. The test in Diotrephes is that he wanted to be first. He wanted to be preeminent. He wanted to be like the banker in our story. And so how is Gaius, who is focused on serving God, to get along with and to truly serve when it's Diotrephes that is trying to have the preeminence? And so this short little book gives us 2 illustrations. Let's start right in. Verses 3 and 4. It gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, telling how you continue to walk in it. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. Okay, John, by the time he writes the epistles, is an older man, and he's looking back, and he said, I have no greater joy than when I hear that people that I have taught, that I have worked with, are remaining faithful. In fact, that's how he is going. He also begins 2 John, writing to somebody else. I don't have any other greater joy than the people that I love and the people that I've taught to remain faithful. And especially the way that Gaius has remained faithful is in practicing hospitality. Dear friend, you are faithful in what you are doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have told to the church about your love. Please send them on their way in a manner that honors God. As we look at the setting of 3 John, what Gaius is doing that John finds as an example of his faithfulness is he is showing hospitality to Christians that are traveling through. The assumption being they're traveling through on doing God's work. And Gaius is there to show them hospitality. We know that Christians had a way of traveling in the first century. When Paul writes Romans, he begins the book by saying that he's never been to Rome before. He hopes one day to come and to serve them, but he hasn't been able to get to Rome. One day he will go to Rome as a prisoner, but that's another story. At the end of the book of Romans, in chapter 16, he mentions 25 different people that he knows, that he has worked with, that he has worked beside, that now are in the church at Rome. He's known them other places in the empire, and now they've traveled to Rome. And he says, tell Priscilla and Aquila hello for me, and all these other people that he mentions, because the people moved around. But there were no Motel 6s in those days. There were inns, but they were kind of shady establishments. And so as Christians traveled, they depended on the hospitality of people like Gaius, who put them up and who helped them along their way in serving God. This emphasis on hospitality is something that is emphasized throughout the New Testament. So we find echoes like this in Romans 12. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. And then 1 Peter 4, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. 1 Timothy 3 tells us that one of the qualities, sometimes we call them qualifications, for an elder to demonstrate is a willingness to show hospitality. In Hebrews 12, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. And then he kind of echoes the Abraham story, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitalities to angels without knowing it. Now, when we think of hospitality, what we think of is having people over into our homes to feed them and to provide fellowship. And that is a wonderful thing for us to do. Our mission statement is to live as God's family under the cross. And one thing that families do is to eat together. And in order to have table fellowship, in order to get to know one another better, and for some reason, I don't know why this is true, but it is true, we seem to drop our guard and talk more freely when we are sharing a meal together. Well, for that to take place, somebody has to provide a setting for that to happen. Now, we're doing that as a large group, as the church this afternoon at 6. Notice how I stick the commercial right in the middle of the sermon. So we want you to come and join us for that time of fellowship as we enjoy hamburgers and hot dogs and other stuff that have no nutritional value whatsoever. But they do provide an opportunity for us to enjoy fellowship. But in hospitality in homes, somebody has to take the initiative in order to do that. And so I think we need a lot more of that going on. But this is different. The kind of hospitality that Gaius is doing is a bit different than just sharing food together as people who already know each other. He is commended for offering hospitality to strangers, Christians who travel through the town that are working for God, that he invites into his home. And John commends him for that and then says in verse 8, we ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together in the truth. In John's phraseology here, when Gaius offers his home, opens his home to the workers of God, he steps into a participation in the work of God along with them. And so hospitality is something that we need to offer to one another. We need to do more of, but we need to remember Jesus' instruction on, when you're going to have a party, who it is to invite to your party. He says in Luke 14 and verse 13, he's chastising the Pharisees and the hypocrites because at their big parties, they wanted to have all the dignitaries in town because that gave them status. Jesus says, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. He goes on to say, hey, these people won't be able to invite you back. Have you ever been invited over to somebody's house and you immediately started fretting because their stuff was so nice? I don't think I could ever invite them into my house. Like that's the only reason we invite people over, so they can invite us back. Jesus says, when you're going to have a dinner, invite people to dinner who need a dinner, who aren't going to eat well unless that you invite them, people that you're ministering to, like the poor and the lame and the blind. Then you will be blessed in the world to come. So when we offer hospitality, one of the things is we need to make sure we're offering it, well, to everyone, yes, but especially to those who really need that hospitality. So Gaius' spiritual gift was in welcoming people into his home and offering hospitality. But he ran up against the banker in town. We don't know whether Diotrephes was a banker or not. In fact, we don't even know whether he was an official leader in the church, but he was somebody that wanted to be first. So in verse 9, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first, will not welcome us. John evidently wrote a letter to the church where Gaius and Diotrephes was, and somehow Diotrephes was able to suppress the letter, and so that it was not distributed. He's opposing any influence in the church except his own. So when I come, I will call attention to what he's doing, spreading malicious nonsense about us. Not satisfied with that, he even refuses to welcome other believers. He also stops those who want to do so and puts them out of the church. Well, here is a guy that, well, to use my dad's favorite expression, he really thought he was something on a stick. And he would have been if he'd had a cork leg. Dad always added that. I never knew what exactly that meant, but it made sense. Some people just think they're the most important, and they want everybody else to think they're the most important. When other people came into the church, even people that were sent by John, Diotrephes saw them as a threat to his influence. And so he used his influence, his power over people in order to get people to reject these other folks. Not only would he not welcome people into the church, he tried to kick out of the church people that did. And John said the way that he did that was by spreading malicious nonsense. That's one of the words that's used to refer to gossip. Although this is a particularly pernicious type of gossip. This isn't the tale-bearing type of gossip when you just talk about things you shouldn't be talking about because they're not helpful, they're not true, they're not uplifting. But this is the kind of gossip where you spread stories about someone with an intent to tear them down, to ruin their influence. Somebody told me years ago about a local political race somewhere else, not around here, where in the days right before the election, one of the candidates started saying, well, my opponent is a known Homo sapien, and his sister is a thespian. What he said was, my opponent is a human being, and his sister is an actress. But he said it in such a way as to cast dispersion on his opponent. Well, see, that's what politics often does. It tries to run down the opponent by untrue, unsubstantiated accusations. And so that's what Diotrephes was doing to the Apostle John, the guy whose nickname is the one whom Jesus loved. He was using malicious gossip or nonsense to run down John's influence so that he could have more influence himself. Well, this idea of leaders who are in it for their own power and prestige rather than to serve God's people is something that is addressed all throughout Scripture. Micah talks about the leaders of Israel, both the political and the religious leaders. Her leaders judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for a price. And her prophets tell fortunes for money. Yet they look for the Lord's support and say, is not the Lord among us? Well, the leaders of Israel were doing it so that people would give them money, so they would be supported, so they would have power, not in order to serve God's people. Ezekiel laments the fact, my flock lacks a shepherd and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals. And because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. And then Jude picks that up in Jude 12. These people, these false teachers that he's dealing with, are blemishes at your love feasts, eating with you without the slightest qualm. The love feast was a fellowship meal that the church in the first century would have as part of their gatherings that sort of set the stage for communion. Like Jesus, when he instituted communion, did it after they had supper together. And so these people would sit down without qualms. They were, Jude says, shepherds who feed only themselves. They were leaders who were only in it for the benefit that they could get. And then Paul told Timothy about these people that cause constant friction between people of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth and think that godliness is a means to financial gain. So here are leaders that are in it only for themselves. And that's what Diotrephes was doing. He wanted to be preeminent, the King James says. He wanted to be always seen as first. One of the things that Jesus condemned the scribes and Pharisees for. What I want you to stop and think about is how frustrating that must have been for Gaius. Here he is putting himself out, spending his own time and money to welcome strangers, to show hospitality, to do the work of God, and the whole time Diotrephes is working against him. He's trying to get people to not do what Gaius is doing. Maybe he's trying to take credit for everything that Gaius is doing. In fact, Paul says that he was trying to put people like Gaius out of the church. How frustrating it is to give your heart and soul to the work of God and then have somebody try to undo that all the time that you're serving. How frustrating must that have been for Gaius? So what's John going to tell him to do? What is the strategy that Gaius is to use to oppose that kind of leader who's in it only for himself? It's interesting what John says. Remember, John has already said he was going to deal with Diotrephes when he got there. But to Gaius, he says this, dear friend, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Anyone who does what is good is from God. And anyone who does what is evil has not seen God. You see, the temptation is when someone is acting ungodly and someone is harming you through their bad influence. Somebody is being harmful to the cause of Christ, is trying to use the same strategies against them that they're using. So him and his bunch are over there doing their evil, so I'm going to get my bunch and we're going to come up with some malicious nonsense to use against them. John is telling Gaius here to stay out of those kind of power plays. You trust God and continue to serve God. You imitate what is good. Don't imitate the evil and Diotrephes over there. I will take care of Diotrephes. In fact, eventually God will take care of Diotrephes. You continue to do what's right. You continue to do what's good, because that is from God. And I think that's a warning to us. Too many churches have been torn apart by political power plays, not just because some evil person started doing evil things, but because those affected responded in kind. We have to continue to do good regardless. Now, there are times when the church leaders have to step in. What John promises, when he got there, he was going to set things in order. But until then, Gaius was not to fall into the danger of returning evil for evil. There are times when the leaders of the church have to put a stop to disunity and those who are causing disharmony. In Titus 3, Paul says this: warn a divisive person once, and then warn them a second time. After that, have nothing to do with them. So eventually, if Diotrephes did not repent of his divisiveness, he was going to be the one that was put out of the church when the apostle got there. So there is a time to respond to disharmony and disunity, and that's on our church leaders. But that should not discourage us from doing what's right. Indeed, striving to serve others despite hardship and difficulty might be the light that shows the grace of God to people. Seeing us respond in a godly fashion, even in an ungodly situation, may be the declaration of the gospel that people around us need to hear. So take a page out of John's advice to Gaius. Continue to do what's right, even if there is a, quote, enemy that is seemingly trying to undo that to the best of their ability. As we sing this next song, if there's something in your life that you're struggling with, that you would like prayers for, some of our elders will be at the back of the auditorium. While we sing this song, just go to the back and tell them what you're struggling with. It may be that you can go down to one of the meeting rooms and pray right now. It may be that they can publish what prayer concern that you have that you would like us to know about. So we're going to sing this next song. I just want to introduce this next song. I've mentioned that I have this strange form of tinnitus where there's music playing in my head all the time. Softly and Tenderly has been playing in my head for the last 2 weeks. And so I thought, what a great reminder to know that Jesus is calling softly and tenderly all the time. And so I thought I would share my song with you this morning. If we can help you, go to the back, and our elders, particularly if you want to put on Christ in baptism and want to start your life of faith. Let's stand and sing together.